Hello, my name's Katie and I work for the Wildlife Trust for Beds, Cambs and Northants. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the importance of recording the wildlife that we see. So in the UK we're very lucky to have some of the most comprehensive records of wildlife in the world. The reason for this is that the Victorians are a little bit obsessed with recording and categorising the natural world and lots of other things, and that habit has kind of worn off on us, and we've got lots of people out there who love to record wildlife, and that's really useful. They say that knowledge is power, and that is certainly true in the world of conservation. Knowing what lives where, how many and when can really be helpful for us as a wildlife charity. The reason for this is because if we don't know what's living where, we don't know how to manage our nature reserves. We can't advise landowners when they ask us for help about whether they can build something somewhere, or whether it might disturb wildlife if they carry out certain activities. It also allows us to see how wildlife is responding to things like climate change. So having lots of these records about all different species is really important. So what do we need to know and why? So the first thing that we need to know is what's been seen and where. So we need to know what's been seen to species level, and also where to ideally a 6-figure grid reference. We also need to know when it was seen. So let's think about an example. There are some woods near to where I live, and we'd like to do some work to help reptiles living in that area. So we've looked back at the records that we have, and we've discovered a record for an adder, so someone saw an adder in these woods 60 years ago. So that's just one adder seen 60 years ago. So what's this really going to tell us? Well, it might tell us that maybe the habitat is suitable, or at least it was back in 60 years ago when the wildlife sighting was made. But the fact there's only one recording means it could have just been a fluke, it might have been a mistake, or it might not no one might ever have seen that snake again. So only having one record from a long time ago can give us a clue, but it's not very reliable. It can't really tell us enough to make decisions with it. So what else do we need to know? Okay, so other things that are really useful to record are how many of a particular animal that has been seen. So if we think back to our adder example, we know that one adder was seen 60 years ago. Now if someone had recorded seeing maybe 10 adders, well, maybe they're doing quite well here and there's a whole colony, and they might be able to recover if they've given the right habitat and chance. But if there's only one adder, that means it's not going to be able to breed because you need more than one to form a colony. And therefore it might just be the lone adder that's left over from a colony, which is not a huge amount of use to us. So it's important to know how many of these particular species you've seen. This is particularly true for birds as well, which might occur in large flocks. So it doesn't necessarily matter if you can't count them exactly, but it's useful to know whether there was one or whether there was 300. That's very useful information. The other thing that's really interesting and useful to know is who recorded this. So if you've got someone who's a novice and they're just starting out a recording and they're really good, but they might make mistakes occasionally, or everybody can make mistakes actually, it's useful to know who recorded it, so that if something seems a bit strange, they can be contacted and the sighting can be verified. So if they've got photos, they can have a look and see if it actually was this creature, or maybe just talk to them about where they saw it and what it was behaving like, and that will allow us to verify the records and find out whether they were accurate or not. So recording who made the sighting is also important. So the more sightings we have, the more reliable the data is, and the more we can tell about what we're seeing and what information it's providing us. So birds are a group that we know an awful lot about, and we have a lot of records for them. There's lots of really enthusiastic birders out there who like to record what they've seen. Birds are quite easy to spot, they're quite active. So this is a group that we have lots and lots of information for. That doesn't mean we don't need more of it. So let's think about a really interesting example, one of my favourite examples actually, from the natural world, and that's the story of the blackcap. So the blackcap, if you're not familiar with it, is a warbler. As the name would suggest, it's got a black head in the males, and it's a warbler that migrates to the UK in the summer, and in the winter it usually migrates more to the Mediterranean where it's a bit warmer, spends winter in the warmer climes of the Mediterranean, and in the following year it will migrate back to the UK and Northern Europe to breed. So a few decades ago, people started spotting blackcaps in the UK in winter. Now this is not what you'd expect. You wouldn't expect to see any, you'd think they'd all be in the Mediterranean at this point. So it was interesting, but you know, some birds get flown off course sometimes, or it might have been a case of mistaken identity. So the first few sightings were interesting, but not really enough to tell us what was going on. So over the next few years, more and more people started recording seeing blackcaps, especially in their gardens, during the winter. So what was going on? There was enough information here that scientists thought this is interesting and there's something going on here, so we're going to investigate it further. And what they actually found out was that there was a whole new race of blackcaps evolving, and partially because of climate change and people feeding the birds in their garden. So traditionally, the birds from sort of northern Europe would migrate south to the Mediterranean for the winter, but a few of these birds had a genetic mutation which meant that they were migrating west to the UK in winter instead of south. Now, ordinarily, before the climate started getting warmer and our winters started getting milder, these birds probably wouldn't have survived. They probably would have died of the cold. They wouldn't have been able to find enough food. However, because of climate change in the slightly milder winters and the fact that people were putting food out in their gardens for the birds, meant that these genetic mutations, the birds with the genetic mutations, were actually able to survive the winter and then breed the following year. And then their offspring also had this mutation, which meant they could then overwinter in the UK as well. So over time, the number of blackcaps spending the winter in the UK increased and increased, and now there's actually a whole race of blackcaps that do that. So this first little nugget of information, because of wildlife sightings, was enough to make scientists investigate, and now because of that we've discovered this whole amazing story about the blackcaps who spend the winter in the UK. So having these reliable and repetitive records can really be really interesting and tell some really interesting stories, and also see how species are evolving in real time, which is fascinating. So there are thousands of people in the UK and around the world that are recording wildlife. So why do we need more? Well, the truth is, it's always useful to have more records, as we've discussed. And for things like birds, we've got loads and loads of records, and that's really useful. So for example, where I work, there's been a new development right next to a nature reserve, and we've tried to work with the builders to make sure that it's not going to harm or disturb the wildlife too much. And because we've got long-term records of how many birds, for example, are spending the winter on the reserve, we can look at how those have changed since the development's been built and see if it's had a detrimental effect. Fortunately, it doesn't seem to have done, which means we're doing something right, and that's really useful to know, because it means we can do that elsewhere now and try and limit the damage that potential new developments might do to wildlife. However, there are other species and other groups that we don't know very much about at all, and there are huge gaps on the map across the UK and the world where you literally have no idea what lives there and what's going on. And this is really not very good, because it means that we could have potentially a really important population of a particular beetle or a particular lizard living somewhere, and someone might want to build some houses on the area, and because we don't know anything about it, that population could get destroyed and no one would ever know. So it's really, really important that we fill these gaps on the map, and that's where you guys can come in. So if you feel like, oh, I just don't know enough about these different things to be able to identify it, I don't know an adder from a grass snake, for example, there are lots of training courses that you can go on. Some of them are free, a lot of them are online now, so it's never been easier to find out more about different species and really brush up on your ID skills. It's also never been easier to record, so if you've got one of these, which pretty much everybody does have now, there are lots of apps out there which allow you to record what you've seen really easily. So they automatically record the time, the date and the location, and you can even take and submit photos to help with the verification of your sightings. And there are quite a few different apps and websites now where you can do this, and we'll list these in the text below the video. So please, if you fancy a new hobby or you find you're intrigued, then please do get out there, brush up on your ID skills if needs be, and do get recording. Every sighting is really important and can help us tell a lot about what's going on in the natural world. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope that's inspired you to get out there and get recording. Okay, thanks.